In the vast and sprawling folklore of country music, certain figures are carved into the very mountainside of its history. They are the pioneers, the innovators, the kings and the queens whose voices echo through the decades. The name Kitty Wells is one such monument. For more than half a century, she was the undisputed queen of country music, a title earned not through marketing, but through the raw, unvarnished truth in her voice. She sang the stories of women who had been silenced, and in doing so she gave them an anthem and a crown of their own. Her light was brilliant, enduring, and it cast a very long shadow. For 74 years, a man stood faithfully within that shadow, his hand securely in hers. That man was her husband, Johnny Wright. To the casual observer, and indeed to history as it is often written, Johnny's role has been simplified, reduced to that of the loyal consort, the man behind the great woman. He was the harmony singer, the bandleader, the gentle presence at the edge of the spotlight. But this convenient narrative, while comforting, is a profound disservice to the man and the artist. It completely misses the fierce ambition that burned within the young musician, the visionary who saw a future no one else could, and the resilient soul who, alongside his musical brother, clawed his way out of poverty and obscurity to the very pinnacle of the industry. Before he was the Queen's husband, he was a star chaser, a harmony pioneer, and a man whose own dreams were as vast and vivid as the Tennessee sky he was born under. This is not a story about the man who stood behind the woman. To tell it that way is to start the story in the middle. This is the story of the foundation upon which an empire was built. It's a journey back to the beginning, to the dust and toil of the Great Depression, to the crackle of a battery-powered radio in a darkened farmhouse, and to the relentless, decade-long struggle of a young man who refused to let his music die in the fields where it was born. This is the story of Johnny Wright, before the world knew his name. To truly understand Johnny Robert Wright Jr., you must first imagine a world without electric light. He was born on May 13, 1914, in Mount Juliet, a small farming community nestled in the rolling hills of Wilson County, Tennessee. In 1914, the 20th century was still a new and distant concept for places like Mount Juliet. Life was not governed by the clock on the wall, but by the rising and setting of the sun. The Wright family home, like most in the area, was a simple wooden structure without the modern luxuries of electricity or indoor plumbing. Nights were illuminated by the soft, flickering glow of kerosene lamps, which cast dancing shadows on the walls and filled the home with their distinctive oily scent. Water was drawn by hand from a well in the yard, a daily laborious task. This was a life of profound connection to the earth. Johnny's father, Johnny Sr., and his mother, P.H. Rilla, raised their family on the rhythm of the seasons. They worked the unforgiving red Tennessee clay, planting and harvesting, their hands calloused and their backs aching. Johnny and his siblings, including his sister Louise, were expected to contribute from a young age. Chores were not a concept. They were a fundamental part of survival. This upbringing instilled in him a work ethic that was as unshakable as it was quiet. It was a life devoid of material wealth, but rich in other more elemental things: family, faith, and community. Music in this world was not a commodity. It was a necessity. It was the air people breathed. It was the sound of his mother humming an old folk ballad while shelling peas on the porch. It was the rousing harmony of hymns that filled the small wooden church on a Sunday morning, the sound bouncing off the pews and rising to the rafters. It was the lively, infectious rhythm of a string band at a Saturday night barn dance, where the community would gather to momentarily forget their troubles, their feet stomping on the wooden planks in time with the fiddle and banjo, Music was the thread that wove the social fabric together, a repository of stories, traditions, and shared emotions. For a thoughtful, observant boy like Johnny, music was also a form of magic. The family's most treasured link to the outside world was a modest, battery-powered radio. On clear nights, they would gather around it, leaning in close to hear through the static and hiss as the powerful clear channel signal of WSM 650 AM crackled to life all the way from Nashville. And through that speaker came the Grand Ole Opry. It was a portal to another universe. The lonesome yodel of Jimmie Rodgers, the singing brakeman, spoke of rambling and freedom. The stoic, mournful harmonies of the Carter family told stories of faith, loss, and the enduring strength of family. These weren't just songs. They were dispatches from a world of possibility, a world beyond the endless rows of tobacco and corn. Johnny would listen, utterly captivated, memorizing the melodies and the turns of phrase. A seed was planted in his mind, the audacious idea that a boy from a lamp-lit farmhouse in Mount Juliet could one day have his own voice travel through that magical box. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the already difficult life of a Tennessee farmer became exponentially harder. The Great Depression descended upon the nation like a biblical plague, and rural communities like Mount Juliet were hit first and hardest. The price of crops plummeted, banks failed, and a suffocating sense of hopelessness settled over the land. For a teenager like Johnny, the future looked bleak. The path laid out for him was one of grueling, low-paying manual labor, a continuation of the life his father and grandfather had lived. He took a job at a local woolen mill, the deafening roar of the machinery a constant reminder of a life he desperately wanted to escape. The work was monotonous and physically draining, but it was a steady paycheck in a time of deep uncertainty. It was in this environment that his musical ambition began to crystallize from a vague dream into a concrete plan. The guitar, which he had learned to play by ear, became his confidant and his vessel of escape. He spent every spare moment with it, his fingers hardening as he practiced the chords and melodies he heard on the radio. He wasn't just playing for fun. He was studying his craft with the intensity of a scholar. He had a natural, smooth voice, a warm and inviting baritone that was perfect for the sentimental ballads and heartfelt stories that defined the music of the era. He started playing with other local musicians, honing his skills at small community gatherings, and anywhere else that would have him. Music was his rebellion, a quiet declaration that he would not be defined by the limitations of his circumstances. In 1937, Johnny's world was irrevocably altered by a shy 16-year-old girl named Ellen Muriel Deason. Their families were connected by marriage. Johnny's sister, Louise, was married to Muriel's brother's brother-in-law, a typically intricate web of relations in a small southern town. They were introduced, and Johnny, at 23, was immediately captivated. Muriel was not a dazzling, outgoing personality. On the contrary, she was painfully shy, a girl who would blush and look at the floor when spoken to. She loved to sing and possessed a voice of startling purity and emotional honesty, but she was terrified of performing in public. She would sing for her family, but the thought of a stage filled her with dread. Johnny, however, saw past the shyness. He heard the extraordinary talent she kept hidden away. He possessed a confidence and a gentle persuasiveness that seemed to be the perfect antidote to her insecurity. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance, rooted in their shared love of music. Their dates were not spent at movie palaces or fancy restaurants, but on front porches with a shared guitar, their voices blending in the humid Tennessee twilight. Johnny began to gently coax her out of her shell, encouraging her to sing with him. He was the first person outside of her immediate family who truly believed in her potential as an artist. He saw the queen hiding within the quiet country girl. On October 30th, 1937, they were married. It was a simple ceremony befitting two young people with more dreams than dollars. As a wedding present of sorts, Johnny made Muriel a promise, a vow as solemn as the one they'd made at the altar. He told her that he was going to be a star on the Grand Ole Opry, and that he was going to make her one too. To Muriel, who was still paralyzed by stage fright, it must have sounded like a beautiful but impossible fantasy. But Johnny said it with a conviction that was impossible to doubt. It was during this time that he gave her the stage name she would carry for the rest of her life. He borrowed it from an old Carter family song, "I'm a-goin' to marry Kitty Wells." The name had a sweet classic ring to it. It suited her. And so Muriel Deason became Kitty Wells, at least on the posters for the small-time gigs Johnny managed to book. The legend had its name even if the world didn't know it yet. The first decade of their marriage was a crucible that would either forge their bond into something unbreakable or shatter it completely. These were the lean years, a period of relentless struggle and itinerant wandering. In 1939, their first child, Ruby, was born, followed later by a son, Bobby, and another daughter, Carol Sue. With a growing family to support, the pressure on Johnny was immense. The dream of a life in music often seemed like a selfish indulgence in the face of hungry mouths and overdue bills. He continued to work grueling day jobs, in mills, on construction sites, whatever he could find, while pouring every remaining ounce of energy into his music at night. It was during this formative period that he solidified the most significant musical partnership of his career. He teamed up with his sister Louise's husband, Jack Anglin. Jack was a phenomenal musician in his own right. He was a gifted songwriter and possessed a high, piercing tenor voice that was the perfect counterpoint to Johnny's smoother, lower register. Together, they were a vocal powerhouse. They began working on their harmonies, spending countless hours practicing until their voices blended so seamlessly, it was often difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. They were tapping into the rich tradition of brother duos that had been popularized by acts like the Monroe Brothers, Bill and Charlie, and the Delmore Brothers, Alton and Rabin. This style of close, intricate harmony singing was the bedrock of early country and bluegrass music, and Johnny and Jack, as they eventually called themselves, became masters of the form. Their early career was a nomadic existence. They chased opportunities wherever they could find them, packing up their young families and moving from town to town, from one low-wattage radio station to another. They were part of a circuit of traveling musicians, a tribe of dreamers crisscrossing the American South. For a time, they were in Greensboro, North Carolina, playing on station WBIG. Then it was on to WCHS in Charleston, West Virginia, and later a stint in Raleigh. Kitty often performed with them, usually billed as a featured vocalist, the little girl singer with the big voice. But the primary focus was always on the male duo. Life on the road was anything but glamorous. They lived in cheap boarding houses and cramped apartments, often just a step ahead of their bills. Johnny would drive for hours in their beat-up car, loaded down with instruments and suitcases, to make a gig that might pay only a few dollars. The radio shows offered a platform, but very little pay. The real money, meager as it was, came from playing live shows in school auditoriums, VFW halls, and rough and tumble honky tonks. These were tough crowds, and the duo had to learn how to command a room and win over an audience that was often more interested in drinking and fighting than in listening to music. This relentless grind was their education. It stripped away any romantic notions about show business and taught them about resilience, showmanship, and the sheer force of will required to survive. There were many moments when failure seemed inevitable. They signed their first recording contract in the late 1940s with a small independent label, Apollo Records. But their records went nowhere. It was a frustrating, demoralizing experience. The dream of the Grand Ole Opry seemed more distant than ever. It would have been easy to give up, to pack it all in and return to the predictable security of a life in Tennessee. Many of their contemporaries did just that, but Johnny's belief never wavered. He was the engine of the group, the one whose quiet optimism and steady determination kept them all going. He believed in Jack's talent, he believed in his own, and most of all, he believed in the promise he had made to Kitty. By the late 1940s, after nearly a decade of paying their dues, a significant opportunity finally materialized. They earned a coveted spot on the roster of the Louisiana Hayride, a weekly radio show broadcast from the Municipal Auditorium in Shreveport, Louisiana. The Hayride was a major league player in the world of country music, second only to the Grand Ole Opry itself. It was known as the Cradle of the Stars because it had a reputation for launching careers. It was the show that would later give a young Elvis Presley his first major break. For Johnny and Jack, landing a regular gig on the Hayride was the biggest break of their career. Their time in Shreveport was transformative. They were performing on a powerful 50,000-watt station, their music reaching a massive new audience across the South and Midwest. They were sharing the stage with established stars and up-and-coming talents, forcing them to elevate their own performance. The years of practice, the thousands of hours spent honing their harmonies, had paid off. They had developed a polished professional act. Their sound was tight, their stage presence was confident, and their unique vocal blend stood out. They were no longer just another struggling duo. They were seasoned professionals on the cusp of something big. The years of wandering, of poverty, of near misses and crushing disappointments had all led them to this moment. They had survived the crucible, and now finally the world was about to hear the music that had been forged in its fire. And so after a decade of countless miles, threadbare tires, and gigs played for little more than pocket change, Johnny and Jack had arrived at the Louisiana Hayride. This was not just another stop on the circuit. It was the proving ground, the final barrier between regional popularity and national stardom. The years of honing their harmonies in cramped apartments and dusty dance halls had prepared them for this moment. They had survived the lean years, their ambition and their brotherhood intact. But as they stepped onto that famed Shreveport stage, they couldn't possibly know that the success they were about to achieve would be greater, faster, and far more complicated than anything they had ever dared to dream. The very foundation of their lives was about to be shaken, not by failure, but by a tidal wave of success that would begin with a song about poison, love, and crest, with an anthem that would crown a queen. After a decade of hardship that had nearly ground their spirits to dust, the Louisiana Hayride radio show in the late 1940s was more than a sanctuary for Johnny and Jack. It was a resurrection. This wasn't just another stop on the circuit. This was the high church of country music, a cathedral of sound whose 50,000-watt signal blessed 28 states with his gospel. To perform on the Hayride was to be anointed, to stand on the same hallowed stage as Webb Pierce and the ghost king of them all, Hank Williams. The grueling years of one-night stands and empty promises had forged Johnny and Jack into consummate professionals. Their harmonies were no longer just practiced. They were second nature, with Johnny's warm, steady baritone and Jack's soaring, plaintive tenor weaving together like silk thread. Their stagecraft, honed to a razor's edge in 1,000 smoky barrooms, could win over the toughest Saturday night crowd. And in this newfound stability, Kitty Wells found a quiet harbor. She stepped back from the spotlight, her role as the girl singer fading into the background. She was, for the first time in her adult life, simply a wife and mother, a role she embraced with a profound sense of relief. The constant struggle for the next dollar was over, replaced by the simple, profound joy of a stable home for their children. She would occasionally join her husband on stage, a familiar, comforting presence. But her ambition had been laid to rest. She was content. Their undeniable talent and growing popularity on the Hayride became a siren song that RCA Victor Records could not ignore. In 1949, they were summoned to sign a major recording contract, a moment of vindication that washed away the bitter taste of their past failures. After a string of solid records that built their name, they struck gold in 1951. The song was Poison Love, a melody they had played for years, but now, backed by the full power of an RCA arrangement, it was transformed into a national anthem of heartbreak. The record became a juggernaut, climbing to number 4 on the Billboard charts and turning Johnnie and Jack, after 12 long years of faith and persistence, into bona fide stars. For Johnnie, this success was the key to the one door he had always dreamed of opening. It was his golden ticket to the Grand Ole Opry. The night he stepped into the sacred circle of wood on the stage of the Ryman Auditorium, it was more than a debut. It was the fulfillment of a sacred vow. Looking out into the crowd, he knew Kitty was watching, and the promise he had whispered to her as a determined young man in a world of dust and struggle had finally gloriously come true. At the absolute zenith of Johnnie and Jack's career in 1952, with their names on the charts and their future seemingly written in the stars, history took an unexpected and fateful turn. The airwaves were dominated by Hank Thompson's massive hit, The Wild Side of Life, a barroom sermon that laid the blame for a man's downfall squarely at the feet of a faithless woman. It was the unchallenged anthem of the jukebox, a verdict delivered from a bar stool. In response, a songwriter named J.D. Miller penned a rebuttal, a stick of dynamite wrapped in a country melody. It was called It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels. Its lyrics were a revolution. They were a woman's defiant answer, arguing with a searing, undeniable logic that it was unfaithful men who created the very honky-tonk angels they so eagerly condemned. The song was so blunt, so unapologetically truthful, that the male-dominated industry recoiled in shock. It was branded as slutty, a career-ending act of defiance. Every established female star in Nashville, terrified of being blacklisted, refused to touch it. It was professional suicide. The song was offered to Johnnie, but not for him to sing. The producer suggested it for the girl singer in his act, his wife. By this point, Kitty Wells had no desire to resurrect her career. She was a mother, a housewife, and she was happy. When Johnnie brought the song home and she read the lyrics, she was horrified. It felt like a violation of the quiet dignity she had reclaimed for her life. She refused, flatly and firmly. But Johnnie saw something no one else did. He saw past the controversy to the song's profound, almost biblical truth. And he knew with a certainty that went beyond love that there was only one voice in the world that could deliver that truth with the perfect blend of heartache and resilience. Kitty's. He pleaded, he cajoled, he insisted. He saw it not as a hit song, but as a prophecy. This was her story. This was every woman's story. Finally, worn down by his unwavering faith in her, Kitty reluctantly agreed. She would record the song not as an artist chasing a dream, but as a wife doing a job, accepting a session fee of $125 to help with the household bills. For her, it was a simple chore for a small fee. For Johnnie, it was an investment in history. The moment the final note faded in the recording studio, a profound silence hung in the air. They all knew they hadn't just recorded a song, they had captured lightning in a bottle. When the acetate disc made its way to the gatekeepers of Nashville, the venerable guardians of a carefully constructed moral universe at the Grand Ole Opry, and the powerful radio programmers, the reaction was not just disapproval, it was panic. In Kitty's plain-spoken, unvarnished delivery, they didn't just hear a risque lyric. They heard a challenge. They heard the collective sigh of a generation of women who had been told to bear their burdens in silence, and it terrified them. The song was immediately banned, deemed an indecent piece of rebellion unfit for the wholesome airwaves of America. But you cannot silence a truth whose time has come. Officially, the song ceased to exist, erased from the playlists of respectable radio. But unofficially, it became a phenomenon. Denied the light of day, the song went underground, spreading through the nation's jukeboxes like a secret gospel. It became the anthem of the unseen. It was the sound of a waitress in a late-night diner, tired of being blamed for the wandering eyes of her customers, who would use her last dime to hear her own frustration sung back to her. It was the knowing glance between factory girls on the assembly line as it crackled from the corner tavern, a shared understanding that needed no words. It became an underground railroad of shared experience, a melody hummed by farmers' wives in lonely kitchens, who felt, for the first time, that they were not alone. The jukebox became the people's radio, an altar of rebellion that the authorities could not control. The rebellion was paid for in nickels dropped into 1,000 glowing machines, one play at a time, until the whispers became an undeniable roar. The numbers became a verdict delivered by the public. The song sold over 1 million copies, a figure so staggering it sent tremors through the entire industry. It didn't just climb the charts, it conquered them, becoming the first ever #1 single by a solo female artist on the country charts. It was a historical milestone that didn't just crack the glass ceiling of the Nashville Boys Club, it shattered it into 1 million pieces. And so, in a twist of fate so profound it felt like fiction, Kitty Wells, the painfully shy housewife who recorded a song for grocery money, who hadn't even wanted to enter the battle, let alone win the war, found a crown placed upon her head. The world had been turned upside down. And Johnny Wright, a star at the peak of his powers, the man whose vision and persistence had orchestrated this entire revolution, was suddenly thrust into a new, complex, and unforeseen role, the architect of his own eclipse, the kingmaker who had just crowned a queen far more powerful than himself. With the explosive, industry-shaking success of It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels, the firmament of their world had been rearranged. Kitty Wells was no longer the shy girl singer standing in her husband's shadow. She was the undisputed queen of country music, a revolutionary figure whose voice had become an anthem and whose name was now a commercial powerhouse. This sudden seismic shift created a dynamic that would have shattered most marriages in the ego-driven world of entertainment. How does a man who has fought for 15 years to build his own kingdom react when he realizes he has with his own hands built a throne for his wife that towers over his own? The years that followed would be the ultimate test of Johnny Wright's character and love. His response would not only define their future, but would also forge a new kind of dynasty, that of country music's first true royal family, navigating a golden era of unprecedented success, all while the clock was ticking toward a tragedy no one could possibly foresee. For Johnny Wright, this was a moment of profound and complex transition. He had just achieved his own lifelong ambition of becoming a Grand Ole Opry star. He was the co-leader of one of the most successful duos in the nation. He was, by every conceivable measure, a success. But the whirlwind surrounding his wife was of a different magnitude entirely. It was a cultural phenomenon. And in the center of that storm stood Muriel Deason, the shy, home-loving woman he had married 15 years prior, who was still slightly bewildered by the crown the world had suddenly placed upon her head. It was in this chaotic period that Johnny made a conscious and pivotal decision. He saw that his wife needed more than a husband. She needed an anchor, a manager, a protector. He seamlessly and gracefully stepped into that role, a move that would define the rest of his life and career. This was not an act of surrender or a quiet resignation to his wife's greater fame. It was an active, strategic, and deeply loving assumption of responsibility. Johnny understood the machinations of the music business in a way Kitty did not. He had navigated its treacherous waters for over a decade, learning to read the fine print in contracts and to spot the disingenuous promises of slick-talking promoters. Kitty, who was still fundamentally a private person, was ill-equipped to handle the relentless pressures of stardom. Johnny became her shield. He took over the business affairs, negotiating her contracts, managing the bookings, and ensuring she was treated with the respect and paid the fees befitting her new status. On stage, the dynamic shifted as well. While Johnny and Jack were still a major draw, the billing now reflected the new hierarchy. Shows were often billed as the Kitty Wells Show, with special guests Johnny and Jack. In performance, Johnny took on the role of bandleader and master of ceremonies. He would warm up the crowd, his easy charm and professional poise putting them at ease. He and Jack would perform a set of their own hits, songs like their chart-topping 1954 smash, "Oh, Baby Mine, I Get So Lonely," which proved they were still a formidable musical force. The crowds would sing along, a testament to their continued popularity. But then would come the pivotal moment of the evening. Johnny would step to the microphone, and with a voice filled with genuine, unfeigned pride, he would introduce the main attraction, his wife. As Kitty stepped into the spotlight, Johnny would retreat a few steps, pick up his rhythm guitar, and become a member of her backing band, the Tennessee Mountain Boys. He would watch her, a small, reassuring smile on his face, as she held thousands of people in the palm of her hand. To the outside world, particularly in the ego-driven culture of show business, this could have been seen as a professional demotion. But Johnny never saw it that way. His pride in Kitty's accomplishments was immense and completely sincere. He had been the one who saw her potential when no one else did, not even Kitty herself. Her success was, in a very real way, his success. He was the architect of her reign, and he took deep satisfaction in watching the world celebrate the masterpiece he had helped to create. There was no room for professional jealousy in the face of such profound love and shared history. They were a team, and her victory was the team's victory. This partnership allowed them to create something truly unique in the 1950s. A touring model built around family. At a time when most male stars hit the road, leaving their wives and children behind for weeks or months at a time, Johnny and Kitty made a different choice. They bought a tour bus and brought their family with them. Their children, Ruby, Bobby, and Carol Sue, grew up with the hum of asphalt beneath them and the sound of country music in their ears. The tour bus became a rolling home, a classroom, and a musical conservatory. The kids learned their school lessons at Danette's in roadside cafes and learned to sing three-part harmony from the side of the stage. This lifestyle established the Wright-Wells clan as country music's first family. They projected an image of wholesome Christian values that stood in stark contrast to the hard-living, self-destructive archetype embodied by some of their peers, While stories of drunkenness and infidelity were common in the industry, Johnny and Kitty were known for their unwavering professionalism and devotion to one another. They were reliable, they were sober, and they put on a great show every single night. This reputation made them one of the most bankable and beloved touring acts of the entire decade. Promoters knew that when they booked the Kitty Wells show, they were getting a drama-free, family-friendly event that would sell out auditoriums and fairgrounds from coast to coast. Throughout the 1950s, their dual careers flourished in this symbiotic arrangement. Kitty released a relentless string of original hits, including classics like Making Believe, and recorded highly successful versions of popular songs like I Can't Stop Loving You, cementing her status as the genre's leading female voice. Johnnie and Jack, meanwhile, continued to chart their own successful records. Their sound, a perfect blend of traditional harmony and contemporary honky tonk, remained popular. They released beloved songs like the rollicking Stop the World and Let Me Off, which became a honky tonk standard, and continued to prove their hit-making power. This decade was their golden era, a period of incredible professional success and personal contentment. They had built a life that defied all the norms of the music business, a stable, loving family at the very heart of a notoriously unstable world. As the decade drew to a close, however, the cultural winds began to shift. The raw, rebellious energy of rock and roll, championed by their old Louisiana Hayride colleague Elvis Presley, was capturing the imagination of the nation's youth. In Nashville itself, producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley were pioneering the Nashville sound, a smoother, more pop-inflected style of country music that eschewed fiddles and steel guitars in favor of string sections and backing choruses. For traditional honky-tonk rooted artists like Kitty Wells and Johnny and Jack, these changes represented a formidable challenge. While their loyal fan base remained, their sound was slowly but surely falling out of fashion with mainstream radio. They continued to be a major concert draw, their legacy secure, but the fight for a spot on the charts was becoming increasingly difficult. They entered the 1960s as elder statesmen of the genre, their names etched into the history of the Grand Ole Opry. After nearly 25 years of weathering every storm the industry could throw at them, the partnership of Johnny and Jack seemed as solid and enduring as the Tennessee hills they came from. Their harmony was more than music. It was the language of their shared lives, a bond forged in poverty and polished in the spotlight. It felt indestructible, but they were about to face a storm of a different kind, a sudden violent tragedy that would not just strike at the heart of their family and their music, but would rip that heart out completely, changing Johnny Wright forever. A cold March wind swept through Nashville in 1963, carrying with it a sense of profound and pervasive grief. On March 5th, a small plane had fallen from the sky, taking with it three of the Opry's brightest stars, Patsy Cline, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and Cowboy Copas. The city was holding a city-wide wake, a community united in disbelief and sorrow. These weren't distant celebrities. They were friends, neighbors, colleagues. Jack Anglin, like everyone else, was heartbroken. On the morning of March 7th, with the city still shrouded in mourning, Jack got into his car alone to drive to a memorial service for his friend, Hawkshaw Hawkins. He was just a few miles from his home in a quiet Nashville suburb when, coming over the crest of a hill, he lost control of his car. In a brutal, senseless instant of screeching tires and twisted metal, Jack Anglin was killed. He was 46 years old. For Johnny Wright, the news did not arrive as a story. It arrived as a physical blow, a sound over the telephone that fractured the world. This wasn't the shared grief the city was feeling for its fallen stars. This was a loss of an entirely different magnitude, a private agony that no one else could comprehend. This wasn't a colleague. This was the other half of his soul. This was the man who had stood beside him in starved-out boarding houses and under the brightest lights of the Ryman. This was the voice that completed his own, the high, lonesome tenor that had been the counterpoint to his baritone for a quarter of a century. Jack was his brother-in-law, his best friend, his musical identity. His next duty was an act of impossible, soul-crushing cruelty. He was the one who had to walk through the sterile, silent doors of the morgue to formally identify the body. To see the vibrant, laughing man he had shared a stage with just days before, now lying under a sheet with an unbearable stillness, was not just a traumatic blow. It was the final brutal confirmation that his world had been cleaved in two. In that single horrific moment, the song of Johnny and Jack was over. The harmonies were silenced forever. 25 years of shared history had been murdered on a quiet suburban road. In the disorienting days that followed, Johnny was forced to confront an unbearable reality. The show had to go on. The tours were booked, the contracts signed. Just weeks after seeing his brother lying on a cold steel table, a heartbroken Johnny Wright had to get back on the bus, walk onto a stage, and sing. The empty space beside him was not just a void, it was a phantom limb, an ache where a piece of his own soul used to be. The microphone stand felt like a lonely tombstone. When he opened his mouth to sing their hits, the songs that had brought joy to millions, he heard only the ghost of a harmony. For the first time since he was a young man picking cotton, Johnny Wright was musically and utterly alone. The golden era had not just ended, it had been extinguished in the most violent way imaginable. The future, once a brightly lit road they were traveling together, was now a terrifying, unwritten page, and Johnny, holding a guitar that suddenly felt impossibly heavy, had to find a way to read it in the dark. In the gray, silent aftermath of Jack Anglin's death, Johnny Wright was a man adrift in a world that had lost its color. The music, once a source of boundless joy, now felt like an echo in an empty room. It was in the midst of this profound grief in 1965 that an unexpected lifeline arrived in the form of a song. Penned by a young Tom T. Hall, Hello Vietnam, was a stark, honest, and deeply poignant letter from a soldier heading to war. In a moment of profound irony, Johnny Wright, a man consumed by a private grief, gave voice to a nation's public sorrow. The song struck a nerve in a country deeply divided and anxious, becoming a massive #1 hit. The success was a strange, solitary echo of the triumphs he had once shared. It proved to the world, and more importantly to himself, that his voice could stand alone. A new solitary path lay open before him, a chance to reclaim the spotlight that had been his first love, to build a new legacy under his own name. For a moment, the ghost of his youthful ambition beckoned. But what was a victory, if not shared? For 25 years, the joy of a hit record, the thrill of a roaring crowd, was the look he shared with Jack across a stage, the brotherly clap on the back in the wings. To chase that feeling alone would be to chase a ghost. The applause would feel hollow, the success empty. And so, at the peak of his potential solo fame, Johnny Wright made the most profound and telling choice of his life. He turned away from the spotlight, not in defeat, but with the quiet wisdom of a man who had learned the true value of his own song. He realized that the pursuit of fame was a young man's game, a chase he no longer had the heart for. He had already found something far more precious and lasting. He understood then that true harmony wasn't just sung into a microphone. It was lived, day by day, in the steady, quiet rhythm of a shared life. He made the conscious decision to devote the rest of his career to being the steadfast steward of the empire they had built together. He became the proud band leader of the Tennessee Mountain Boys, the charming host who warmed up the crowd, and the rhythm guitarist who stood faithfully behind his queen. His proud introductions of Kitty each night became legendary, not the words of a supporting act, but of a master architect showing off his finest creation. When she was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1976, his beaming face in the audience was that of a man who had fulfilled the promise he'd made to a shy 16-year-old girl nearly 40 years earlier. Their 74-year marriage became their ultimate encore. After retiring in 2000, his final and most important role became clear. As Kitty's mind faded under the fog of Alzheimer's, Johnny became her devoted caregiver, her memory keeper, her constant. In the end, his life was not a story of what might have been, but a testament to a truth he discovered amidst his greatest loss, that the brightest legacy is not a name in lights, but a love that endures until the very last note is played. When Johnny Wright passed away in 2011 at the age of 97, he left behind more than a catalog of hit songs. He left a legacy woven into the very fabric of country music, a story told not in thunderous solos, but in perfect, unwavering harmony. His legacy is multifaceted and immense, each part a testament to the quiet strength of his character. He was a pioneer, a master of the brotherly harmony that formed the bedrock of the genre. The sound he and Jack Anglin perfected was a conversation in song, a seamless tapestry of two voices becoming one that captured the heartache and hope of rural America. That sound became a blueprint, influencing countless duos for decades to come. He was the ultimate queenmaker, a visionary with the courage to see a revolution in a song that everyone else saw as a risk. In championing Kitty Wells, he didn't just launch a career, he held the door open for every woman who would follow, for Loretta, for Tammy, for Dolly, rewriting the rules of who was allowed to sing the truth and proving that a woman's perspective was not just valid, but commercially powerful. He was a survivor, a man forged in the unforgiving Tennessee clay of the Great Depression, who faced the shattering loss of his closest friend and musical partner, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He absorbed the most devastating blows life could offer and continued to stand, not as a diminished man, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And finally, above all else, he was a partner. His 74-year marriage to Kitty was his true masterpiece, a testament to a love that was also a working partnership built on absolute trust and mutual respect. He was the constant North Star in her universe, the steady hand that guided their family through the treacherous waters of fame, and the loving caregiver who saw her through the final fading twilight of her life. His life stands as a profound and gentle lesson in a loud and ambitious world, that true greatness is not always measured by the ego's desire for the spotlight, but by the soul's capacity for harmony, the heart's commitment to love, and the quiet, enduring strength of a life well lived.